Help Jews in Poverty at helpjewsnow.org. Your $25 gift today will help provide a life-saving food box to Jews in need. Be a blessing right now. Visit helpjewsnow.org. That's helpjewsnow.org.
This is a CBC podcast.
Hi, I'm Nora Young. Welcome to a brand new season of Spark. It's a new chance to tackle the rapidly changing technology of this very strange time. It's been a head-spinning period the last year and a half as the pandemic had us collectively questioning the way we did things. It's been a hugely disruptive time, but that disruption gives us the power to realize we can do things differently. Last season, we looked to the past to see how it informed the present. This season, our focus is how does today inform the future? What happens next? And how can smart uses of technology take us where we want to go? And we start with the future of fashion. Recently, I was walking around my neighborhood in downtown Toronto when I noticed a building that had been knocked down. Now, that happens all the time, but this building was the Canadian Steam Iron and Sewing Machine Building. It seemed like a sign of the times, the end of an era when many people would sew and mend their clothes, when you would invest in technologies to keep your clothes in shape because clothes were valuable. The average global consumer now buys 60% more clothes per year, but keeps them for half as long as they did 15 years ago. And a lot of that behavior change is because of a huge shift in the fashion industry.
In the late 1990s, early to mid 2000s, the fashion industry just went through this incredible transformation into this fast fashion, disposable fashion industry that we live in today.
This is Elizabeth Klein.
I am a journalist and the author of 2 books on ethical and sustainable fashion. You know, I think for a younger generation that grew up in the era of fast fashion, it might be surprising to learn that at some point in the not so distant past, you wore your clothes, sometimes until they wore out. Clothes were more expensive.
In 2012, Elizabeth wrote Overdressed, The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion. It was one of the first books to uncover the impact of the garment industry on the environment and society, and it paved the way for the current sustainable fashion movement.
There is an incredible generational awakening and interest in sustainability. Ethical and sustainable fashion is a much more mainstream concept than when Overdressed came out. But then, you know, the grand irony is, of course, there's more clothing being manufactured every year than ever before. And the fashion industry keeps talking about the need for systemic change, but it can't seem to figure out how to pivot, or maybe it just doesn't want to.
Today, there are lots of apps that appeal to people interested in sustainable fashion. For example, Depop lets you sell your own clothes that you no longer want, or buy new-to-you clothes from other sellers on the app.
There's a big buy button on every single listing that your customers can press to purchase any product from you.
Not ready to sell off that favorite shirt? You can rent it out to others using a service like Tuileries. Want to be stylish with what you've already got but don't know how?
Cloudwell helps you love the way you look by dressing you in the clothes you already own.
At the same time, though, there are shopping apps that make it incredibly easy to buy lots of new clothes at very low prices. For example, Chinese clothing company Shein has overtaken Amazon as the leading shopping app. The average price of an item of clothing? $10. In that sense, technology has become a double-edged sword. It's helped the industry meet growing demand and made production more efficient, but it's also allowed for vast overproduction thanks to the demands of fast fashion.
I think social media is such a big factor in terms of how quickly trends can spread and disseminate throughout culture. It's a cliche, but what is in style today could be out of style tomorrow. You know, as soon as someone famous has worn something, the next day everyone has to have it, and then the day after that, it's no longer cool. So social media has certainly done a lot to accelerate trend cycles. And then technology has also enabled factories to produce more quickly and more efficiently. And this is not just true of fashion. It's like every single kind of product we buy, electronics, home goods, furniture, all of that stuff it's cheaper than ever before. It's more convenient. It's the experience of purchasing things is much more frictionless. Of course, during the pandemic, we've seen a slight slowing down. You know, it takes longer to get some products delivered to our houses. But in general, yes, our society tends to pull towards overproduction, making things very cheaply, in a very like wasteful, linear way. Mm-hmm. But I mean, there's like the positive side of how technology has transformed sustainable and ethical fashion is of course it's enabled the rise of resale platforms, right? Like when Overdress came out, that resale platforms like ThredUp and The RealReal and Poshmark and Depop, those things didn't exist. Talking about secondhand shopping was still kind of seen as, a countercultural, like it was a very niche thing. So apps have certainly transformed what's possible in terms of giving people more sustainable ways to shop that didn't exist. Mm-hmm.
I mean, this I find fascinating, and it is partly, I think, fueled by the boom in these apps. Like on the one hand, we have the rise of this resale sustainability movement as like a cool and popular thing to do. And on the other hand, fast fashion kind of on steroids, where you have this extremely cheap clothing that people are buying hauls of and often sharing on social media. What do you make of that kind of duality of those two extremes?
Well, I mean, we have to remember that the reason why resale is such a big thing is because there's so much used clothing out in the world, right? It's like, it's the flip side of fast fashion. The reason why there's so much incredible, gently used clothing is because there's such an enormous amount of overproduction happening. People are wearing their clothes for a shorter amount of time. So that's the sort of critical side of it, right? The kind of resale economy that we have today is really only possible in a fast fashion world. But on the other hand, it is absolutely true that there is a generational shift in consciousness. Like people, of course, are way, way more interested in sustainability because we're living through a climate crisis. Like people understand that there's an urgency to change our lifestyles, especially in like high income nations where, we tend to buy too much. Our cultures are very much oriented around like wasteful consumerism. And I think especially for young people or anyone on a budget, resale is going to continue to be popular because it's affordable and sustainable, right? Like it's not just a morality thing. Like it's something that meets another need, which is people need to put together a wardrobe that works for them on a budget they can afford.
Mm-hmm. What role did the pandemic play in breaking down clothing's global supply chains and that sort of traditional cycle of consumption?
I mean, the pandemic has had a crushing impact on global supply chains. Last March, when retail stores were closed across much of Europe and North America, unfortunately, big brands, their first reaction was to try to refuse payment to their factories for clothing they had already manufactured. And millions of people were laid off without pay. It like unleashed this devastating humanitarian toll on garment workers. And, we have to remember that the big brands are the ones that control the fashion industry. And I mean, the people who made those decisions initially, it was everyone. It was like, Gap, PVH, H&M, Zara, every household name you can think of. So I actually was part of a campaign called Pay Up to get those factories paid back. And of the initial $40 billion that brands owed at the beginning of the pandemic, about $22 billion has been paid back.
Wow.
And then after that, the brands went back to the factories and started asking them to produce clothing for even less than they were producing them at before the pandemic. So they've been going back and asking for discounts in prices, forcing factories to produce below the cost of production. And then, if you were interviewing a brand about their perspective on it, what they would say is like, we've just seen all these supply chain delays. Like it's harder to get move textiles through the system, get raw materials. There's lots of shipping delays. But my concern is like making sure these huge companies are responsible to their essential workers.
Mm-hmm. So how do we quantify sustainability when it comes to fashion brands? Like, how do we certify that they're indeed sustainable and what they're selling is sustainable, or that their labor practices are sustainable?
That's such a good question, Nora. And it's like something, honestly, we could spend probably hours unpacking. I do think that there's a growing understanding, especially just in the past year, where people are starting to really push back on some of the greenwashing in fashion. And, there is this sort of common refrain where people will say, well, there's no such thing as sustainable fashion. I think that's maybe like a little bit of a cynical take on it. But the point is, right, that like producing anything has an environmental impact, right? And if you are a corporation whose business model is really oriented around cycling through lots of products, how much of a difference does it really make if you're going to switch over to, say, more recycled polyester instead of virgin polyester, or organic cotton versus conventionally grown cotton? And one of the problems with figuring out when brands are really sustainable is that there's not a lot of data. Fashion brands will often launch a sustainable collection and say it's made out of recycled polyester, for example. They often can't even back up with any sort of data or scientific study how much of a reduction in impact those collections are even having. So the industry is in this like transition mode where it knows it needs to change. There's a lot of pressure being put on brands because there is a lot of greenwashing happening, and consumers are savvy. Like they could spot it, when they see brands kind of overselling their environmental credentials, especially like young people on social media, they like pick up on it like right away.
Do you think that it's possible that these companies are doing more harm than good, in the sense that they're trying to give consumers the sense that we can go on buying and buying and buying guilt-free because they're quote unquote sustainable? Yeah,
I think that they're warding off the inevitable, which is that the fashion industry is going to have to fundamentally change for us to be sustainable. And greenwashing creates a lot of noise and confusion and mistrust. You're asking me like, what is sustainable fashion? Like, I think a lot of consumers feel that way right now too. But these are conversations that are happening across society, right? Like, this is not this conversation about how to rebuild our society in a sustainable way is not unique to fashion. And I just, I want to say that because like, this is going to be a tough transition, right? Like, these companies are used to operating in a certain way, and shifting is going to take a lot of public pressure. It's going to take a lot of policy, and it's going to take a lot of innovation. They can't keep making all this stuff and resell it on the side. They have to also reduce their impact.
I'm Nora Young, and today on Spark, we're talking about tech's role in building a more sustainable fashion future. Right now, my guest is consumer culture and sustainability expert Elizabeth Klein. Earlier, we talked about greenwashing, the way some companies give the appearance of being environmentally friendly, whether or not they really are. As a consumer, it can be hard to know. For example, some retailers offer recycling bins for used clothes, with the stated intention of being repurposed into new items.
Yeah, so there are a lot of brands now that do the take back program. So they'll have like a quote unquote recycling bin in the store. So there are two things I'd like to say about that. Is first, a take back program run by a company does not in and of itself reduce the environmental impact, right? That doesn't mean that they're actually producing less clothing every year, or that they're using the clothing that they collect to make new clothing. Usually what happens with clothing take-back programs is they are sold into the global secondhand waste stream. So they'll end up, if they can be reworn, they're probably like exported to other countries and reworn as secondhand clothes, which is great. That's great. Like, we want clothing to be reused, but for consumers, it's a sort of greenwashing, because in their mind, they think their clothing is actually being recycled back into clothes, which last time I checked, if that's happening at all, it's happening at like a very, very, very small level. So it's one of those solutions that I think there are redeeming aspects to it, but really for it to reduce the environmental impact, it would just have to be designed in a really different way.
I mean, the other argument in all this, though, is that fast fashion is in some ways democratizing in the sense that it offers style at a low price. Do you think that a model of sustainable fashion can really be affordable?
Yeah, I do. Absolutely. I think that a more sustainable fashion industry, when we have those conversations, like oftentimes people will picture something that's the total exact opposite of the current system that we have, which is everyone going back to owning maybe 10 garments and wearing them until they are worn out. I think that there is a tremendous amount of space in between where we're at right now and where we need to be that doesn't involve people feeling deprived of fashion. Like, let's say, for example, we wanted to pay living wages to all of the garment workers in the world. In some countries, like in India, that would add maybe 20 cents to the cost of a garment. It's negligible. And I think that that would also be a really interesting tactic to reduce the amount of clothing that brands are producing as well. Because any increase in the price of clothing is going to result in some sort of reduction in production. I think a big question, though, Nora, is like, how much less does the clothing industry need to produce to bring it back in line within the planetary boundaries? It's something that we need an answer to, and I haven't seen a lot of good studies on it. But I suspect that it doesn't mean that we have to go back to a world where we don't have any fashion. But can we continue living in a world where we're producing, what is it, 110 billion garments per year? No, we can't. We can't. Yeah.
Can you just give me a sense of that, though? Like, how much more stuff are we producing than we used to? Like, how bad is this problem? What's the scale that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, usually, the statistic that gets floated around is that production of clothing has doubled in the last 20 years. And then it tends to grow. The fashion industry, textile production tends to grow by another 3 to 5% every year. So that's an additional several billion garments per year.
Wow.
On top of what we're already overproducing. And also, of all of that stuff that's getting produced, it's mostly being sold back to consumers in middle and high income countries, right? It's only going to a very small percentage of the world's population. So then you have to start imagining what's going to happen when everybody else decides they want to buy all of this stuff. That's what I'm saying. Is like, we can change the industry and produce less without depriving people. Because in the United States, I don't know what the statistics are in Canada, but we're consuming, it's like over 60 items of clothing and 7 pairs of shoes per person. It's just a lot.
Yeah.
Could people be happy with half that? I think the answer is probably yes. And then maybe like half those purchases would be new, and then the other half could be secondhand, for example, or rented.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about these apps that focus on the resale of pre-worn garments like the RealReal, Depop, Vinted. What's your take on them?
I think it's great. I think it's fantastic. I buy a lot of clothing secondhand, and I think that they've opened up new pathways for jobs. Like, I know a lot of people who have secondhand businesses now because of these apps. They're able to resell clothing, make a little bit of extra money. I know some people who this is their full-time job, right? Is reselling clothes. And I mean, there are also on the other side, there's been some very legitimate criticism of the bigger apps, right? Taking away, from locally owned charities and thrift shops, that sometimes these companies aren't transparent about what they do with the clothes they can't sell. So it's not, it's not a perfect solution. But I find it, on the whole, to be really, really, really exciting.
Yeah. So where should the responsibility be for a push towards a more sustainable future for fashion? Is it with the production of garments, or is it with us as consumers, or is it both?
It's absolutely both, but I would say the piece that's missing in the puzzle is going to be policy and honestly, like public pressure to get the industry to change. I was mentioning earlier, the fashion industry is controlled mostly by very, very big conglomerates that are resistant to, it's difficult for them to change. So as much as I think some people who work within the big brands want those companies to change, it's just a challenge because they're sort of stuck operating the way that they operate. So brands have to produce less. Consumers have to demand ethical and sustainable products. But really, it's in the space of policy and public pressure that this is going to get done. I think it's very connected to what's going on with climate change. We've let it get so out of control, and now people are starting to take action. And that's really what we're seeing in the fashion space as well. People just getting more involved in advocacy and protest movements to really push on companies to get them to change.
And are you hopeful for the future?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A lot of my work in the past year has been focused on systemic reform of the fashion industry, starting with the Pay Up movement, which secured the $22 billion back to factories during the middle of the pandemic. We are currently working to pass the Garment Worker Protection Act in California, which would raise wages in California's fashion industry to the minimum wage. There's now a global movement to hold brands to account to make change. I just want to encourage people who are listening to use your voice as a citizen, that we can't only do this as conscious consumers. That's one part of it, but that's not going to get us over the finish line.
If there are people listening to this who think, but I love clothes, I don't want to feel guilty, can you give us a couple of sort of tips, a couple of things that we could put into practice in our daily life in the week ahead, maybe to think a bit more sustainably about the clothes that we wear and maybe the activism that we engage in around it?
Yeah. I love clothing, and everybody I know in the ethical and sustainable fashion movement loves clothes. I think that that's what brings us to this work, is a respect and an appreciation for this industry and hope and faith that it can be a transformative force for good, that it doesn't have to be exploitative and it doesn't have to be unsustainable. We've already mentioned many times that reuse is sustainable. If you don't want to get bogged down in figuring out which fabric is green, because I know people get really overwhelmed with that. Just remember that sustainability really is pretty common sense. Love the clothes that you've got. If you're going to shop, try to buy things that you're actually going to wear. Buy secondhand, rent when you can. And, in terms of organizations to get involved with, I am part of a nonprofit called Remake. There's also many other NGOs in this space doing lots of good work. Fashion Revolution, Clean Clothes Campaign. Link up with other people and use your voice. It really is going to take collective action to push this industry to do the right thing.
Elizabeth, thanks so much for your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Elizabeth Klein is the author of the books Overdressed, The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion, and The Conscious Closet, The Revolutionary Guide to Looking Good While Doing Good. Coming up, more in our look at the many ways our digital tech both facilitates and mitigates waste, and what role it could play in a sustainable fashion future.
We buy cheap, we buy more, we throw more away. Canadians on average buy 70 new articles of clothing a year. That contributes to the 12 million tons a year of textile waste dumped into North America's landfills.
Brand new things ending up in landfills? What's going on?
It's surprising, isn't it? Because when you send things back, you expect that someone else is going to be able to buy them. They end up back on a store shelf or on the website, and then someone else just jumps on there with their credit card and buys it. But that's often not the case. We're talking things like electronics, including cell phones, but also household items like mattresses. Some pretty big stuff you can imagine going to landfill, or if it's burned, that's a lot of carbon emissions as well.
Help Jews in Poverty at helpjewsnow.org. Your $25 gift today will help provide a life-saving food box to Jews in need. Be a blessing right now. Visit helpjewsnow.org. That's helpjewsnow.org.
You know your smart, funny friends who always seem to have the best celebrity gossip? I'm talking about the ones who always know what you should be watching or reading or listening to. Well, what if you could pick their brains every week? Pop Chat is a brand new podcast that does exactly that and feels like spending time with your best friends. So join me, Alameen Abdul-Mahmoud, and a panel of the smartest culture critics that I know as we dissect the discourse, but also have a great time doing it.
I'm Nora Young, this is Spark, and today we're talking about how tech can help build a more sustainable fashion future. The fashion industry has become increasingly dependent on digital technologies. We saw this during the pandemic. Bricks and mortar businesses turned to e-commerce like never before. Major marketing events like fashion weeks all turned online. But beyond that, tech has helped brands meet growing demand, making production more efficient. On the other hand, it's facilitated mass overproduction thanks to the demands of fast fashion. But it isn't just the garment industry that got us into this mess. It's partly that the point-and-click ease of online shopping makes it simple to just buy things on a whim and then return them. Who needs to try on that new pair of pants? Just buy them in several sizes and return what you don't want. There was an obvious appeal to that during pandemic lockdowns. Maybe, like many of us, you've just assumed that your returned item is resold. But sending it back doesn't necessarily mean it makes it back onto the shelves.
Okay, are we ready? Let's get these trackers in.
In 2020, CBC Marketplace put trackers in 12 Amazon products they bought and then returned.
All going right back. And all with these GPS devices hidden inside.
And it just fits right in there.
Only 4 items were actually resold to Amazon customers. The others sat in warehouses for months, traveled thousands of kilometers, or went straight to a landfill. Since then, new liquidation centers have been popping up all over Canada, selling returned items from Amazon and other online retailers at reduced prices.
Got my mask on, so we're in kind of like a nondescript area of suburban Toronto and Mississauga.
We sent our intrepid reporter Adam Killick out to Mississauga, Ontario, to a place called Crazy Bins to see what a room full of your discarded online purchases really looks like.
To give you a sense of the size of this place, it says during COVID the capacity is 412 people. And there are these just bins and bins of stuff. People walking around with portable forklift trucks, carrying stuff to dump more stuff into these bins. It looks like it's completely chaos. There's books, mats, plastic knives and forks, iPad covers. Oh look, there's a pair of underwear. Seriously, people return underwear and it goes to a store? Anyway, there you go. People are just kind of rummaging through stuff. I keep saying stuff, but there's no really other way to describe it. There are these just clapboard wooden homemade bins of 2x4s and old scraps of wood, and like there's no price tags on anything. People are just kind of sifting through it like it's... Oh look, here's a Irish themed shamrock dog costume. Giant squirt guns, the Healthy College cookbook, towel racks. There seem to be iPad covers in every single bin. And I'm trying to be generous, but I haven't really seen a single thing that would be interesting. It's kind of funny because at the back it says there's a bulk section, but everything in here kind of looks like a bulk section. There's a big sign that says, "Please do not open boxes and packages." I don't see a single person that is actually following that rule. Well, that's about as much as I can manage.
Adam's jaunt out to Crazy Bins really highlighted the negative impact of tech on consumerism. It's so easy to click and buy, have it arrive, say, meh, and send it back. As with many of our super convenient digital services, the buy and return cycle tends to conceal the labor and the waste that lies underneath. You just see the packages magically arrive and then magically be taken back. One of the biggest contributors to product return waste is clothing. Estimates are that in the US alone, returns create 5 billion pounds of landfill waste. And that means all those free returns aren't really free at all. But what potential does tech hold in addressing sustainability issues and countering the very problems it's made possible?
From a studio floor to shop floor, you can really use digital to change the way you work.
This is Leanne Elliott-Young. She's a London-based curator and creator. Her work focuses on fashion futures, digital innovation, sustainability, and industry disruption. She's also the co-founder of the Institute of Digital Fashion, alongside designer Kati Tay, who works with 3D printing.
We birthed IODF in a view to creating a space, a platform that could restructure how technology is used and look at it for a democratic tool for change.
Through the IODF, they want to address persisting issues in the industry, like waste and pollution, elitism, and lack of diversity.
There were lots of frustrations, so we decided to come together and birth an institute which had a manifesto that was about how can we upend this broken system and be an emblem for change. Meaning, as we step into this new era of digital, into the metaverse, how can we make sure that we were going to look at building an inclusive and diverse reality?
We'll get back to that part about the metaverse in a little bit. As we heard earlier in the show, there are lots of apps that aim to help people buy more wisely or use the clothes they already have. For instance, Save Your Wardrobe lets users make a digital catalog of their clothes and offers ways to upcycle their garments so they last longer.
Using the app is simple because we use your email receipts to digitize your wardrobe. Then the artificial intelligence recommends new items and new outfits based on what you have.
Some online retailers are also offering virtual fitting rooms with an eye to getting us out of that cycle of buying a bunch of stuff and returning what we don't want. For Leanne, these apps are part of a much bigger shift in our technological future, into a collective shared digital space where our physical and virtual realities converge, where the line between offline and online is blurred. That's already happening with technology like augmented reality that lets you virtually try things on. Now, about those apps.
I think they're all really important, as we are now in a time where the IRL and the EURL are very much working in unison. For a long time, if you spoke about VR, that was a very lonely space. You had to put on those goggles. And you had a wild ride, but it was very much just yourself in that experience. Gaming as well was a very singular notion. All of a sudden, with augmentation and AR, it's meant that you can step into a brand universe. You can now try on clothes. And for a long time, that was seen as perhaps just a play tool. Whereas now, because of the global pandemic, e-com has been, specifically in fashion, it's shifted the online sales, and just people being online is a much more comfortable space. But the online experience was very binary and very transactional. So trying to bring some of the wild, immersive, fun regalia of fashion and the fantasy of fashion into the digital space is what augmentation has certainly allowed. And that's where these apps, I suppose, take you into that space.
Yeah. Do you get the feeling that they're changing behavior, or that they have the potential to change behavior, like that they're actually making people think about different ways of extending the lives of their clothing, for instance?
Yeah, I think that right now, the idea of a digital try-on is almost a two-tiered conversation. One, it's about your digital self, your avatar, and the online version of yourself. And then there's the play in that space. And the second tier is trying on a garment, so wearing a garment in a view to then purchase it in the physical world. I suppose how a digital asset can become tangible in your life. And I think that it was something that was quite jarring for a while. Like, what does digital actually mean? What does digital fashion actually mean? And how can I be involved in digital fashion? What's the need of it and the purpose of it? I think now more and more, because of the technology is catching up with our times, I suppose, now thinking, it means that there's like valid responses to that. There's the fantasy and the experience and the play. And then there's the retail space But then again, with digital fashion, there's so many more benefits rather than just the side of the consumer. As a designer, if you're using a software and creating a digital asset, a digital version of your design, you can click through and see lots of different fabrics. And for sustainability, that's fantastic. But also for the creative process, which I think is ignored quite a lot of the time when you're talking about digital. The fact that as a designer, you can see in a silk and then you can see in a python your ideas. And that's super exciting. The fact that you can flip in and out and through these possibilities, which would have taken, number one, you would have had to create the fabrics. They would have then had to get to you. There's a lot of wastage when you're building these toiles and different ideas. And so I think that's a really exciting part of the conversation that is missing.
Can we talk about that a little bit more? What are some of the other interesting ways that you're seeing digital technology improve the production side, especially around this idea of greater sustainability?
Yeah, so for us, there's a few softwares that are really changing the game. Clo3D is the one that we specialize in, and that is a space in which you can act in the same way a physical atelier would, and it gives you lots of options of seeing your ideas come to life. It's very technical, but also it allows you to, act as a physical atelier would. So part of IODF, we have an academy. We really feel that these kind of softwares are very much the future of the industry. But we realize also as well that it's not very democratic as to who has access to them. So we want the opportunity for lots of individuals from different walks of life and backgrounds to be able to have these tools and to be able to play with these softwares and also learn how to step into the fashion industry with not having to do an unpaid internship and, work the way up the fashion ladder, but instead really, jump in and get involved in this new digital revolution.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps not have to invest in such a huge amount of fabric if you can do your sampling digitally as opposed to having to actually make these iterations in the physical world. Yeah,
absolutely. And it really is a fantastic opportunity. And I think, that really is missing in that part of the conversation. Obviously, like sustainability is a big issue here for us all. But what digital fashion can do is really give you the abilities to try and explore further than you ever imagined. And also, if you're building your brand identity and your brand universe, you can effectively, within a digital landscape, create the furthest fantasy in which your mind can go. In digital, there's no gravity. You can really play. And I think that's another opportunity for digital, is to really feed into the fantasy.
I'm Nora Young. Today we're talking about fast fashion and how tech could help disrupt the global garment industry and further the sustainability movement. Right now, my guest is Leanne Elliott-Young, a London-based curator and creator. So the ability to use digital technologies in fashion opens up creative possibilities for designers, freed from the constraints of fabric budgets and even gravity. Digital fashion also opens up possibilities for consumers to experiment with digital versions of fashion. In high-end fashion, a couple of times a year, designers get together to show off their collections in a handful of big cities, with Anna Wintour in the front row. Last year's fashion weeks went digital because of the pandemic. Leanne says that shift will lead to lasting changes in terms of sustainability, but also access.
I think it was a really good moment that showed that we don't have to fly around the globe to see fashion. We don't have to be front row of Fashion Week to experience fashion. For a long time, the fashion industry was very coveted. The only people that attended Fashion Week were buyers and press, peppered with a few celebrities. Now you've got thousands of influencers. The Fashion Week's got bigger and bigger and bigger and we're more like concerts. But you'd have Fashion Week, and then it wasn't until 6 months later you could then see the products in the stores. So there was a big kind of cut-off point and a pause moment from seeing it on Instagram. The designers under the pressure of having to build bigger and bigger experiences, which is, again, a lot of waste and a lot of money for them, for an emerging designer, for you to throw everything into a big theatrical performance. And sometimes the clothes being lost in this and having to invite, bigger and bigger venues to invite more and more people. And then those external of that, the people who were watching on social media, like grabbing some of the information from there, there's a big pause into them when it got into the stores. And then lots of the communication was missing. So all of a sudden, the Digital Fashion Week and actually allowed for the designers to have a bit of a breather space and think, what am I communicating? And what's the ROI from this? What am I getting from the show? And actually putting it all back and really considering, is it right to show seasonally? So there was a big contemplation for the point of Fashion Week. What does it serve for you as a designer, especially emerging designers who have lots of creative and really want to build big experiences? And actually, you could see that the word emerging designer was always almost used because the next season they'd just be drowning and then disappear. So I think all of a sudden it took the pressure off, and people were also contemplating, what does fashion mean right now? So the digital really did step in at the right time. And you saw some of the experiences. One that we delivered was taking fashion to the streets. So we actually occupied the billboards, the fly posted and big campaign sites, and delivered Fashion Week to the masses. We used the billboard spaces to not only deliver a campaign image, but also deliver QR codes with links to augmented experience. So you could walk in amongst and very much be within the Fashion Week that everyone was missing. I think that was also super exciting. All of a sudden, experiences became something else. It wasn't just delivered for the front row, and fashion became much more conversational. People were striking a discourse rather than just showcasing fashion. People were talking about fashion, the ephemeral notion of it and what it actually meant. And that's, I think, really what happened during those Fashion Week seasons that we lost in COVID, the real contemplation on the future of fashion.
So do you think those changes might be permanent? I mean, even assuming we one day gets past the pandemic, that this is a real watershed moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right now we're building augmented experiences that really do democratize fashion. We created for London Fashion Week, a world's first digital collection with Ouroboros. They're a digital only brand, because with digital fashion, the big conversation is, and a shadow that surrounds it. How do you go from to view to wear? Like, what does digital fashion mean? And we made a digital try on, so you could actually, as well as seeing the show at London Fashion Week, you could also wear it. And that got 1.5 million views in the first 2 days, or day 2. So that just really showed the appetite for digital fashion. And that was a big moment for us when you realize, like, goodness, people really do want it. They want to play with it. They want to effectively allow this digital universe to wrap around their physical. And I think we're seeing that a lot more now. The physical shows, there'll always be the physical shows, but I think it will be a lot like how publications are now. You have the coffee table big book, which is printed on archival paper within the highest quality. It's hand bound, and it's very as an artifact of something which almost is nostalgic. And that's where shows, big shows, will occupy that space. And the rest of the industry, I think, certainly will pivot and step into a much more experiential place where you can see fashion in a new nuance, which is about digital and physical wrapping around one another and combining and working in unison, where experiences with the consumer and not just with the elitist front row. Yeah. And for us, that's really important. How can we democratize and also build a more inclusive, diverse and sustainable industry?
But what do we really mean by digital fashion? In part, that's simply the tools we've been talking about that let designers try out virtual versions of designs, or let you and me try out clothes on an avatar of ourselves. But looking into the future, lots of tech companies are banking on the idea of the metaverse, shared digital environments where you can interact, hang out, and share experiences with other people virtually. In that vision, why do clothes need to be physical at all?
Digital making takes a lot of craft and artisan. In the same way a fashion house would work, you have a pattern cutter, you have the creative director, it takes a whole team to create a digital garment in its full sense, rigged to a body, rigged to an avatar. It's not just the fabrication of it. So it takes training a certain amount of excellence is needed, and any craft takes time. That's the sheer explanation of craft, right? Is to take over, 1,000 hours. So how do you deliver and democratize digital fashion and make it more accessible? But people are still getting paid. There's not this kind of bottom end where people aren't getting paid, the materials aren't made sustainably. It's the rate in which they're shipped and created. I mean, we can all talk about stats of fast fashion. I think we're all aware of that. But the question is, what is the future of digital in that respect? Well, a digital asset can go further. The fact it can be on 1,000 bodies and it never ages or falters. But then how do you own a digital garment? And what is the price point of a digital garment? And what is the worth of it? All of this is really up for conversation at the moment. There are apps in which you can buy digital garments.
You mean digital only? Like they don't actually exist as a physical thing that you put on your body?
Yes, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that's
wild.
Yeah, so, like what is the worth in that? Because there's digital twins where we were talking before, like how you could try something on in digital realm and a view to purchasing it. But I think the future, which we're seeing now and we're developing, actually one of our projects is part of this, is using blockchain to map where your digital garment has been and who owns it, so it becomes an asset. But then also, where do you wear this? Well, right now we're in a time where AR, still you need to hold a phone up to you to be wearing the garment. There's still a screen involved. But with wearables, with glasses, it means that you can see within real time without having to link it to hold the device up to the person or the image. I think that's the next step. And Apple and Samsung are both obvious movers in that space. But again, due to COVID, production's been slowed on that. And I think that point, which we're working for as digital makers, that's going to be the point where we see this massive seismic shift again, where you can just be wearing a simple chic lens. You'll be able to look around and see the whole of this metaverse, augmented buildings. And that also really interested me, which is a big conversation right now in our kind of like tech landscape, is who owns that space? Who owns the augmented building, which is in front of me, It's real estate. It's digital real estate. It's a really interesting conundrum as we step into that world of dual reality.
And I guess, if we're already at the point where people in gaming environments, want to augment what their avatars are wearing, so why not take that into another broader fashion
real
world?
Yeah.
From The Spark, Archives, 2019.
My name is Emily Salvador.
Hi, I am Pınar Yanardağ.
Nora and I saw the little black dress from the 1920s, and it's such a fashion staple that we thought it'd be a great idea to try to recreate that using artificial intelligence. And so how this works is basically we use this fancy machine learning algorithm called the Generative Adversarial Network.
So after we feed the GAN algorithm a bunch of different vintage designs, we explored what kind of things it is coming up with.
And we were getting some dresses that were pretty bizarre.
Something like little black dress where one of the arm is a normal sleeve and the other one is a bell sleeve, and there were some asymmetric details in the neck and the skirt line.
Or a weird hemline, or maybe there's a piece cut right out of the middle.
So we thought this is really interesting. We can work with AI as collaborators, not as competitors.
AI has the power beyond the creativity to make things more accessible and more diverse too in the process.
I'm Nora Young, and right now on Spark, my guest is Leanne Elliott-Young, co-founder of the Institute of Digital Fashion. We're talking about the future of the industry and what role technology could play in that vision. Leanne explains how things like artificial intelligence and biomimicry are moving the fashion industry into a more sustainable future.
AI is a really interesting space. We're in lots of conversations right now on avatar builds and AI, but then there is the problem with the kind of pre-programmed bias that exists with AI. That's a whole nother conversation show. But right now, I think that, again, it's problem solving and understanding the data. And that's where AI really comes into play. On a really basic level, AI can understand the customer, the demographics, and really tailor production to those needs. It can deliver you the insight into what your audience is saying, thinking, feeling by looking at and scrolling through all of the data they have on those specific demographics. And it can pinpoint how you talk to them. And when I say talk to them, I mean the ads that you run, what you show them. Brands can effectively pivot into, using that word pivot all the time, but get out my vocabulary. They can restructure their company and have different creative outputs. AI almost acts as a subconscious. It knows when you don't make a decision and why. So you can tailor your production based upon that. You know why your drop-shouldered red garment didn't work, and you can really pinpoint the information about it. So when you're on the cutting table and you're going through fabrics, you can have a kind of pinpoint what worked, why it didn't work, how it didn't work. It feels quite a scary prospect, doesn't it? There's all that information about us whirling around.
But on the upside, do you think that could then, those types of insights could help reduce waste? I mean, presumably if you know what your client base wants better, then you're not making a whole lot of stuff that doesn't sell and ends up in the landfill.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing with fashion. Fashion was always prediction, to be in fashion, to be in vogue. It's all about what's the hottest right now. Thumbs up, thumbs down. And that changes so quickly. And the fact it's seasonal, and like for one season, your collection is famed and you are rejoiced. And then a season later, that exquisite object, this has gone into production, it exists in this world, is all of a sudden relevant in another season. That's insane. It doesn't make much sense. And it's so throwaway. And I think what we're learning more and more is that if you have this insights and information, there's obviously a lot less waste because you're making almost to those orders, in fact. And I think that as a designer, that's not taking away the flair and the creative spurs of genius. The most tangible icons in fashion history are those dark, macabre geniuses. And I think if you said to like McQueen or Rick Owens, I can give you an algorithm, they'd probably be insanely upset about the notion of it. But it's exactly the same as if you're within East London, there's certain hangouts in which you can understand where and what's going to be the flavour of the month, and you can see what people are wearing. So it's almost like an algorithmic walk to the pub where the zeitgeist are,
I've read about engineered lab-grown natural fibers inspired by biomimicry, for instance. Among the projects out there working to find new ways to produce sustainable materials for clothing, are there any in particular that leap out at you as promising or particularly innovative?
Yeah, I think there's so many new fabrics coming through, which are really exciting, like Pinatex using the pineapple, and there's the mushroom leathers, and then there's, lab-grown products that can effectively wrap around and respond to your body. They can cool you down. They can then reheat you if you plummet to a specific temperature. I think all of that is super exciting, and it really does, again, what is the function of fashion? I think that's a conversation that isn't brought up much. But then again, going back to sustainability, how sustainable are these new materials that are, vegan or made from a different product? I think that certification and legislation is what we should be talking about, because I think as an industry, we really do need legislation. I think fashion is so behind on that. And I think when we can have a real true certification of what is the damage and what information and transparency do we have about the production of these products, that is always the grey area you find. Stores and retail are really struggling with that. Because there's a new innovative technology, as we've seen with NFTs, for instance, there is the pushback on sustainability, or within these new innovative products, it really need to drill into 360 the production of it and make sure that there is full transparency, because there are some grey areas. Yeah, so hopefully our governments will align at some point and have some hindsight in the fact that if we all singing from the same song sheet, hopefully we'll get there quicker, especially with the climate crisis we're in right now.
Leanne, thanks so much for your insights on this.
Oh no, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Leanne Elliott-Young is the co-founder of the Institute of Digital Fashion. As we were making this week's show, I kept thinking about how fashion tech is an example of what happens so often with digital innovation. It can make things much more efficient, scale up to a global level, and connect people peer to peer. At the same time, that very efficiency can turbocharge things in ways that create whole new problems. As in the case of fashion, tech can be part of the problem and part of the solution. You've been listening to Spark. The show was made by Michelle Parisi, Adam Killick, Samarwit Johannes, and me, Nora Young, and by Elizabeth Klein and Leanne Elliott-Young. And from the Spark Archives, Emily Salvador and Pinar Yanarda. Follow Spark on your favorite podcast app, and you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, Spark CBC. I'm Nora Young. Talk to you soon.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.